if you don't know how to form the subjunctive, or if the subjunctive is completely new to you, then this is a great lesson for you. The first thing you need to know about the subjunctive all by itself, that's not a tense. The subjunctive is a mood. Did you know that? In French, you have different moods. So, all of those other tenses you've learned, the present tense, the passé composé, l'imparfait, le plus que parfait, etc., etc., all of those fall under the umbrella of the indicative mood. That's what it's called. So, you've got the indicative mood and then lots of tenses that fall under that umbrella. Then you have the subjunctive mood, and it also has different tenses, not as many. The ones that are actually spoken and used in a non literary sense are going to be the present subjunctive and the past subjunctive. There is no future subjunctive. So keep that in mind. There are a few other moods in French. The conditional is a mood, and under that umbrella, we have the present conditional and the past conditional. The imperative is a mood as well. D'accord? Usually, when we're going to use the subjunctive, it's because what we're about to say includes some element of doubt. Usually. Now, later in the master class, we are going to talk about other situations when the subjunctive is used and there's really not an element of doubt. So there's a lot that you just have to learn, but don't worry, we'll get lots of practice in. For today, and in today's quiz, we're going to really focus on using the subjunctive with the expression or after the expression il faut que. Because quite literally, il faut que means it is necessary that. So I can tell you it's necessary that you learn the subjunctive. And you might tell me, well, it might be necessary, but I've gotten along just fine without it until now. So you see how it's so that there's an element of doubt there. If I tell you, you need to do this, it is necessary that you do this, the outcome is considered subjective. That's what this is all about. So let's talk about using, or rather, forming the subjunctive. Now, in the indicative mood, for example, when you were learning the imperfect tense, let's just take that as an example. You started by figuring out how to form your stem. Do you remember that? You had to find out how to form the stem, and then you had to learn endings that went along with that particular tense. So the present subjunctive works exactly the same way. The first thing we need to do is find the stem. Now, this is where it's going to come in very handy to remember your present tense indicative conjugations. And the present tense, especially with irregular verbs, that's harder than a lot of the other tenses because they're all so different, right? You can have many verbs, irregular verbs I'm talking about, that are just conjugated in such different ways. Well, you're going to have to remember the third person plural form of the present indicative of a verb in order to form the subjunctive. So if you get to one that you don't know, consider it a learning opportunity and look it up. So you start with your third person plural form of the present tense, and you take off the ENT. That's how you get your stem, or you might have heard it referred to as the radical. I'll just call it the stem. So let's start just by taking a quick look at the regular verbs. So let's talk about the verb manger. That's an ER verb. Like I said, you're going to take the ENT off of the third person plural form of the verb, and then you get your stem. So M-A-N-G, you see the third person plural looks like this. Il mange. So we take the ENT off, and then we end up with this, mange, M-A-N-G. This is your stem. That's what you're going to start with to form the present subjunctive. Then you have to add the subjunctive endings. So what they are for je, it's E. So it will be que je mange. And for all of my conjugations, I've put que in front of them because when you're using the subjunctive, you will always have que before the clause that follows. So the je form, you start with your stem and you just add an e. Que je mange. For the tu form, you're going to do the same thing, but your ending is es. Que tu manges. Now the il, elle, on forms, of course, all look alike, and the ending is just an e. So qu'il mange, qu'elle mange, qu'on mange. Now these three forms for er verbs, que je mange, que tu manges, qu'il mange, they look exactly like the present indicative, but they are the subjunctive. For the nous and vous forms, they do look a little different because your endings are different. The subjunctive ending for the nous form is ions. Que nous mangions is how it's going to sound. Que nous mangions. And for the vous form, que vous mangiez. So those two do look different than the present tense indicative conjugations. But the plural third persons verbs conjugations, the ending is ent. So qu'il mange, qu'elle mange, those look exactly the same as they would in the present indicative. The verb choisir, we're going to find the stem the same way. Take the ent off of the third person. So this choisisse, choisiss. You can't forget the second. A lot of my students actually forget this second bit right here, the extra iss. Don't forget that because that's your stem. You have to have that or your conjugation is not going to be correct. So we start with that as our stem and then we just add the endings. So let's go through and say those together. Que je choisisse, que tu choisisses, qu'il choisisse, qu'elle choisisse, qu'on choisisse, que nous choisissions, que vous choisissiez, qu'il choisisse. Lots and lots of S's. That's why I chose the verb choisir as an example, so you could see it is correct to use all of those S's. Now let's look at one more regular verb group, and those will be verbs ending in RE, or rather, I should say verbs ending in DRE, like attendre, vendre, for example. Form the stem the same way, so it looks like this, ATTEND, and then we add our endings. So let's say all of these together. Que j'attende, que tu attendes, qu'il attende, qu'elle attende, qu'on attende, que nous attendions, que vous attendiez, qu'ils attendent, qu'elles attendent. So that's it for your regular verbs. Now let's take a look at some that look a little bit different. So the verb écrire, as you know, is an irregular verb. So this is when you have to tell yourself, okay, what's the present tense conjugation of this verb? Let me remember the third person plural form of the verb so that I can get my stem. Yes. J'écris, tu écris, il écrit, nous écrivons, vous écrivez, and your magic, ils écrivent. That's our third person plural form. Take off the ENT and here you have your stem. D'accord? So we start off with the stem, écrive, and then we add the same endings that we saw before. So let's say all of these together. Que j'écrive, que tu écrives, qu'il écrive, qu'elle écrive, qu'on écrive, que nous écrivions, que vous écriviez, qu'ils écrivent, qu'elles écrivent. So that one looks quite different to the regular verbs that we saw a little while ago. Some verbs, if you'll recall your present tense conjugations, some verbs are stem changing verbs. So if they are stem changing in the present indicative, they will also be stem changing in the subjunctive, in the present subjunctive. Let me show you what I mean in case you're like, what are stem changing verbs? Let me show you like the verb boire, for example. Do you remember this now that you see the conjugation? The je, tu, il, elle, on, and then the plural il, elle forms have a different stem than the nous and vous forms. That's what I'm talking about when I say stem changing verbs. The really nice thing is that we're going to remember these stem changes in the present subjunctive. They're going to be the same. So, what we have to do still is start with the third person plural form of the verb. So, that will be your qu'il boit, or this will be your boive, right? Look up here at the top. Here it is in the present indicative. Ils boivent. That's our conjugation. So we take off ent and then we have the stem boiv. That's when we add our endings. Remember, nous and vous are going to have a different stem. The nous and vous form is buv. Do you remember that present tense conjugation? All right, let's read through this present subjunctive conjugation together. Que je boive, que tu boives, qu'il boive, qu'elle boive, qu'on boive, que nous buvions, que vous buviez, qu'il boive, qu'elle boive. So listen, like I said in the beginning, this is all about forming the subjunctive. We're not even talking about so much how to use it. Today we're going to use it using il faut que. So the reason why we're only doing il faut que today is so that you can really, really focus on forming the subjunctive correctly. All right, let's do the verb envoyer. Envoyer, now, nous and vous have an irregular stem. Do you remember that? Because the present tense, j'envoie, tu envoies, il envoie, nous envoyons, vous envoyez, and then ils envoient. So in your nous and vous forms, you have this envoy stem, and then the endings come after. But up here at the top, we're going to look at the verb envoyer. So your third person plural is ils envoient. We're going to take off this ent right here, and then we have our stem envoie. D'accord? So let's go through this conjugation together. Que j'envoie, que tu envoies, qu'il envoie, qu'elle envoie, qu'on envoie. Que nous envoyons, que vous envoyez, qu'ils envoient, qu'elles envoient. You see, it's not any different. Learning how to form this subjunctive is not any different than learning any other tense. You can see it's not that difficult. You just have some formulas to follow. The verb prendre also has two different stems. So remember that we're going to start with the third person plural form. And in the indicative, that looks like ils prennent. Okay, so do you remember that? Ils prennent. It has two N's in it in the il form. So that's going to be our stem once we take the ENT off. But the nous form and the vous form, those only have one N. And that's important for pronunciation reasons. Because listen to how these sound. Que je prenne, que tu prennes, qu'il prenne, qu'elle prenne, qu'on prenne, que nous prenions, que vous preniez, qu'ils prennent, qu'elles prennent. So the difference with that is with the E-N-N-E, it's N, que je prenne. And for the nous form, for example, it's not an N sound, it's prenions, prenions. So our E is for the nous form is going to sound like E. And for the je form, for example, with the E-N-N-E, it's going to sound like E. N prenne, prenions. D'accord? And then we have a verb like venir. So as well, in the present, let's do the present tense conjugation together. Do you remember it? Je viens, tu viens, il vient, elle vient, on vient, nous venons, vous venez, ils viennent, elles viennent. So this right here, you see this ils viennent, elles viennent? Those look exactly the same in the present subjunctive as they do in the present indicative. So what we have to do is take this vienne, remove the ENT, and there we have our stem VIENN. And then add the endings. And you're going to see how when you have two N's, it affects the pronunciation. Que je vienne, que tu viennes, qu'il vienne, qu'elle vienne, qu'on vienne, que nous venions, que vous veniez, qu'ils viennent, qu'elles viennent. D'accord? All right, so those are verbs that have two stems. Now, what about verbs with irregular stems and regular endings? So what I mean by the irregular stems, a verb like faire, and you can guess the likely culprits, faire, pouvoir, savoir, these are going to be the verbs with one stem, and they're just really irregular. Because the verb faire, what's the third person plural of that in the indicative? It's font, F-O-N-T. So there's no E-N-T to take off. So how are you going to find your stem? Well, you're going to learn it because it's irregular. It's F-A-S-S. All right? And then F-A-S-S, and you add your regular endings. So let's read through this together. Que je fasse, que tu fasses, qu'il fasse, qu'elle fasse, qu'on fasse. Que nous fassions, que vous fassiez, qu'il fasse, qu'elle fasse. So just one stem for all the forms, even nous and vous. All you have to do is memorize that and then stick the subjunctive endings on there. Another couple of verbs with one stem will be pouvoir and savoir. So the stem for pouvoir is P-U-I-S-S. Now here, don't get confused because the third person plural indicative is peuvent, P-E-U-V-E-N-T. So there is an ENT on it, but pouvoir is still just completely irregular. Your stem for all forms is P-U-I-S-S. So let's read through these together. Que je puisse, que tu puisses, qu'il puisse, qu'elle puisse, que nous puissions, que vous puissiez, qu'il puisse, qu'elle puisse. By the way, there's no particular reason why I forgot to put qu'on puisse in there. All right, and the verb savoir, to know. It's also highly irregular. Que je sache, que tu saches, qu'il sache, qu'elle sache, qu'on sache, que nous sachions, que vous sachiez, qu'il sache, qu'elle sache. Those are ones you just have to memorize, but the endings are the same. Now we get into our absolute favorite verbs. We're going to have aller, vouloir, and then we'll get to avoir in a minute. Aller has two stems. And you can guess that it's going to be your nous and vous forms that are different. And this is all about pronunciation. That's the whole reason for this. So the verb aller, for the je, tu, il, and plural il forms, your stem is A-I-L-L. So let's just go over the pronunciations of those, and we'll skip nous and vous for right now. Que j'aille, que tu ailles, qu'il aille, qu'elle aille, qu'on aille, qu'ils aillent, qu'elles aillent. Now the spellings are different, but did you notice that they all sound exactly the same? So that's good for pronunciation purposes. The A-I-L-L-E, you get that I, you get that Y sound. But the nu and vu forms do not have an I after the A. It's not A-I-L-L. The stem is just A-L-L. And that's because you have another I coming up in the ending, I-O-N-S and I-E-Z, and that would just, it would make the pronunciation not flow. It would make it extremely difficult to pronounce, and it wouldn't sound very pretty. So it's just A-L-L. Listen to the pronunciation. Que nous allions, que vous alliez. Did you hear the strong L sound? So those double L's there do not sound like a Y. Let's go through this one again. Que j'aille, que tu ailles, qu'il aille, qu'elle aille, qu'on aille. Que nous allions, que vous alliez, qu'ils aillent, qu'elles aillent. All right. Now we have the verb vouloir. Vouloir, it's a very common verb in the indicative, and it's also very common in the subjunctive. So we're going to have two stems here. Once again, the culprits for the extra stem are going to be the nu and vu forms. So before we look at nu and vu, let's just pronounce all of the other forms. And I'll bet you'll notice that they all sound exactly the same. Que je veuille, que tu veuilles, qu'il veuille, qu'elle veuille, qu'on veuille, qu'il veuille, qu'elle veuille. Now there are lots and lots of vowels in there, but you just have to get that ay sound in. Ay. You can do it. The nu and vu forms, you don't have to do that though, because the stem is just V-O-U-L. Que nous voulions, que vous vouliez. Do those look familiar? They look just like the imperfect, don't they? But the context would tell you that this is the subjunctive. And plus you would have a que before them. All right, you'll get some practice with this, don't worry. Let's go through the whole pronunciation again. Que je veuille, que tu veuilles, qu'il veuille, qu'elle veuille, qu'on veuille. Que nous voulions, que vous vouliez, qu'il veuille, qu'elle veuille. Now is when the fun really begins. Now we have verbs. Now, there's only two of them, okay? Verbs with irregular stems and irregular endings. How about that? Avoir and être, probably the two most used verbs in French. And you know what? You're going to use these a lot. When do we use avoir and être a whole lot? In which tense? Well, the passé composé. These are our helping verbs in the passé composé. Some verbs use être, other verbs use avoir. Well, guess what? You remember all the time you spent learning everything you had to know about le passé composé? It's going to come in very handy for the past subjunctive because you're going to follow all of the passé composé rules to use the past subjunctive. The only thing that's going to change is that your helping verb, whether it be avoir or être, your helping verb will be written this way in the present subjunctive. The past participle will stay the same. Agreement will stay the same. All of those extra rules you learned about pronouns and whatnot, all of that stays the same. It's just the helping verb that has to be put in the subjunctive. So that's really nice to know. Now let's get this pronunciation for the verb avoir down right away first we're just going to do the je, tu, il, and plural il forms because you'll notice that, again, the nous and vous forms have irregular stems. They also have irregular endings, but let's do the other ones first. Don't let all of the vowels confuse you. There are no accent marks over any of these vowels, so we're not going to do something silly like j'aille. No, we don't have to do that. It's que j'ai. That A-I-E is just pronounced E. Que j'ai, que tu es, qu'il est, qu'elle est, qu'on est, qu'ils aient, qu'elles aient. They are all pronounced exactly the same way, even though they're all spelled differently. The pronunciation is the same. Now, the nous and vous forms, que nous ayons, que vous ayez, you do not have the I in the ending. You see, the ending is just O. The endings are O-N-S and E-Z. And this is only for the verbs être and avoir. D'accord? The same thing will happen down here when we get to être. So let's go through the whole conjugation again and pronounce it. Que j'ai, que tu es, qu'il est, qu'elle est, qu'on est, que nous ayons, que vous ayez, qu'ils aient, qu'elles aient. Super. And the last one for the formation of the subjunctive, the verb être. You will notice that the nous and vous forms have an irregular stem, which is S-O-Y. So let's not deal with them just yet. Que je sois, que tu sois, qu'il soit, qu'elle soit, qu'on soit, and then the plural, qu'il soit, qu'elle soit. They all sound exactly the same. The nous and vous forms, que nous soyons, que vous soyez. There is no I in the ending here. All right, so let's go through that whole conjugation. Que je sois, que tu sois, qu'il soit, qu'elle soit, qu'on soit, que nous soyons, que vous soyez, qu'il soit, qu'elle soit.